Keith Richburg has been a print journalist almost his entire adult life. Originally from Detroit, Michigan, he worked for the Washington Post for 30 years. His assignments included 4 years in Southeast Asia, from 1986 to 1990, Africa for 3 years, then 5 years in Hong Kong, a time as New York City bureau chief from 2007 to 2010. Richburg also was based for the Washington Post in Paris, later as China correspondent. In addition, he had his time in Afghanistan and Iraq. Keith Richburg is currently the director of the University of Hong Kong Journalism and Media Studies Center. We ask him to talk about his work. Keith Richburg, when did you decide that you wanted to live in Hong Kong?
Oh, well, that's really interesting. I was actually coming out here on a visit, actually, to Taiwan to see some friends. That was when I was in graduate school way back in 1983. I was going to graduate school in London and was coming out to visit some friends studying Chinese who were going to go to work in Beijing. And the plane stopped in Hong Kong, and I did not realize in those days you needed a visa to go to Taiwan, which I did not have. And so I kind of got stuck in Hong Kong for 3 or 4 days, but then ended up walking around the city and thinking, wow, what a great place. I can't wait to come back here and live one day if I can do that. So it took me a while, but I was able to come back as a correspondent for the Washington Post in 1995.
So how many
and
years?
Then came back here again.
How many years have you been living there permanently?
This time I've come back. I was here as a correspondent from 95 until 2000, so I was able to see the handover firsthand. This time I've been here since 2016, full-time teaching journalism, so it's my second time here.
What is it to be the Director of Journalism and Media Studies at the University of Hong Kong?
Well, it's a terrific job. I left the Washington Post in 2013, January, and tried to decide what I wanted to do, what's the second act, and did some teaching in the U.S. first for a semester. I taught a semester at Princeton as a fellow there, and I spent a semester at Harvard, and I was kicking around, really wanted to get back to Asia when this job was open. It's a relatively small journalism department. We have an undergraduate program, about 30 or so undergraduate students for each year, so a total of about 120 or 130. And we have a master's degree program. That's a one-year program, starts in September, ends in June. We've got a fairly small staff, about 7 full-time instructors, and then we use a lot of what we call adjuncts, who are journalists who are working in the field who come and teach 1 or 2 courses for us. And it's basically, I teach a couple of courses. I teach a course on feature writing. I also teach another course on covering global affairs. And it's kind of running the department, deciding which courses that we're going to offer, helping recruit new staff to come in, and kind of setting the general direction for this journalism program and churn out young journalists who are going on and now working at places like CNN and NBC, Bloomberg, Agence France-Presse, the French news agency, AP, Reuters, the South China Morning Post, the local paper. So we're really proud of kind of what we've been able to do here in a few years.
Given what we hear about the Chinese censorship, what kind of restrictions are placed on you?
At the moment, I could say none. And we are a department of the Faculty of Social Sciences, so I report to the dean of the faculty, and he has told us full steam ahead. So far, the word from the president of the university is that we should not self-censor or self-limit. So we haven't changed. We don't do anything differently than we did before, even though there's this new national security law in place that has resulted in a real kind of rollback of some of the freedoms that we've enjoyed here. But as far as we're concerned, we're teaching, fact-based, independent journalism. We don't teach propaganda. And nobody's told us to do anything differently. Nobody's knocked on the door. Nobody's given us a call. So we do what we've always been doing. We have not changed a thing. We teach one course on media law. Of course, the instructor for that course has had to add obviously had to add a few weeks in to talk about the national security law. But we haven't really changed anything that we do here. We're teaching the journalism the same way we've taught it before.
Is there any restrictions on the internet use for you? about anything that you can see here in this country?
At the moment, no. At the moment, there's no restriction on internet use, which is very different from China, of course, where when you're in the mainland of China, Gmail and Facebook and Twitter and a lot of these tools that we're used to are off limits. You can get to it using a VPN, but normally those are cut off, and also websites are cut off. It's very hard to get to the New York Times, for example, or BBC. But at the moment, there's been no restriction on internet access to anything. We can pretty much do anything we wanted to here in Hong Kong, pretty much the same way as before.
I watched you give a speech. Actually, it was on YouTube that you gave at Stony Brook a number of years ago. Mm-hmm. And you talked a lot about something called Weibo. And it was in the early days. And you said, I'm looking forward to seeing what happens with Weibo. Do you want to tell us what it is and what has happened to it? Yeah, Weibo is kind of like Chinese Twitter, really. It was a big a site that was actually quite popular among most Chinese to get on and talk about issues. We called it Chinese Twitter. It was for short blog posts, that kind of thing. It's interesting when it first kind of burst onto the scene when I was in Stony Brook University. That was about 10 or more years ago. At the time, I was kind of thinking that this was going to be one of the things that might particularly, especially democratize China. It might bring about a democratizing effect. For the first time, as a journalist, we were able to know what ordinary Chinese were thinking by going to Weibo and looking at what the conversation was, looking what was being discussed online. At the same time, it also kind of, I would say, took away the Communist Party's monopoly on the conversation and information. People could exchange articles that had appeared overseas. People could exchange views. Since then, it has, I must say I was wrong. It did not have this kind of openness effect. It did not kind of open up the conversation as much as I thought, because the Communist Party authorities in China kind of brought the hammer down on Weibo quite a bit. So it's much more constrained. It's much more censored than it was before. They started doing things like, for example, making people who post on Weibo start using their real names. You could no longer post anonymously, which took away a lot of the kind of the open conversation and the spontaneity of it when people were required to post their real names on it. They started doing things like censoring and even going to the point of tracking down people who were posting things considered anti-government or anti-party or simply just things the party didn't like. Some things were considered rumor mongering. They came up with all these new laws against posting things that were considered rumor, posting things that were considered causing trouble. And so it really kind of tamped down that kind of openness of conversation now. They also, the authorities in China also went after what they considered the big users, people with 1 million or more followers. And they started calling those the verified users. And it's got a V, the letter V for verified next to their name. So they went after what they called the big V, so those who had 1 million or more users. And in other words, those who were particularly popular at posting things. And they some of them got warnings, some of them got arrested, but they were basically told to kind of rein it in, toe the party line, stop posting things that were against the party, against the government, or that the party didn't like. So I have to say that Weibo is a shell of what it used to be. It's a shell of its former self. A lot of that conversation has moved on to a new online platform now, to WeChat, which is a smaller platform that has closed groups instead of open groups. So instead of people posting things can be openly read by everybody, WeChat is more like something like a WhatsApp, which allows people to only post within a smaller circle of people. But even still there, the conversation is far less kind of open, far less critical than it used to be. I haven't seen this for a while, but for a long time I noticed that periodically the Washington Post and other newspapers would tuck into the paper the China Daily, a Communist Party Oregon. Why would the Post do something like that? I know they paid them money, but without any really significant disqualifiers.
Well, that's a good question. I don't know exactly. I believe it was simply a matter of they were distributing it, probably some kind of a financial arrangement because China Daily needed to be distributed. I would probably have, if anybody had asked me, which they did not, I might have cautioned that, look, you don't really want to be associated with China Daily, which is it's a paper that's the English language paper that's basically wholly owned by the Communist Party in China. It's not something I think we want to be distributing, freely in the U.S., particularly a reputable paper like my old home, the Washington Post. So, I'm sure that was just a business decision made by somebody. I don't know if it still happens or not, but I would probably have advised against it if anybody had asked me.
Just before I came down to do this podcast with you, I got on a site that you suggested in your Stony Brook speech to people to look at called the Global Times. And I think you said that was part of the People's Republic media operation. But I saw a headline on there, and I just wanted to ask you about this, and I read the story. And the headline was, Xi Jinping, to attend Martyrs' Day event and present flowers in Tiananmen Square. And, of course, I looked up Martyrs' Day, and I thought it's odd that that headline would be on that website because of the several hundred people that died at Tiananmen Square, but this has nothing to do with that event. So how often do you see things like that, and are you familiar with Martyrs' Day?
I was not familiar with Martyrs' Day. I suppose, to me, I think it probably has something, perhaps has something to do with World War II. I'm not 100% sure. But, Tiananmen Square is the big square in China that they use for big events. They use it for the big Communist Party anniversary, which comes in October. October 1st is National Day, which is coming up soon. We remember Tiananmen Square primarily because of what happened in 1989 and June 4th when pro-democracy students were kind of massacred. They occupied the square, and the People's Liberation Army moved in with armored personnel carriers and tanks, and many people, dozens or hundreds, were killed on or around Tiananmen Square. That's how we remember it. But it is the square where all kinds of major events do take place. They have parades there, et cetera. It's now relatively fortified to make sure that there's no other kind of repeat of Tiananmen Square. Although I don't think that could happen again. But it's a common thing for events to be held there. The martyrs that they're talking about are probably not the martyrs that we remember from June 4th, 1989. It's something. What happened in 1989 is a memory that the Communist Party authorities have been very, very, very conscious about trying to stamp out.
What's the difference? Because you lived all over the world. What's the difference living in Hong Kong, let's say, anywhere in the United States?
Well, that's a great question. To me, the first time I set foot here, and even still, Hong Kong to me reminded me of New York City. There's nothing like New York anywhere else in the country or the world in terms of the buzz you get, that kind of urban built up capital city where everything's going on. Just in terms of the 24-hour life of the city, the pulse, the urban pulse of it, the high rises, et cetera, except in Hong Kong. To some degree, it also kind of what might remind you of San Francisco because they also have mountains here. So it's kind of, Hong Kong is nestled into kind of a mountainside. So, you got the beauty of San Francisco with the mountains and the sea, but you also have that kind of buzz of New York City. And again, someone was asking me where I might go to after Hong Kong, and I was saying, boy, it's really hard to say, but only New York City has that same kind of urban buzz that you get in Hong Kong. It's a very crowded, dense, high-rise city. There's a lot going on. The great public transportation system, very efficient. But they do have outer islands. They do have kind of country parks. They do have hiking trails. So it's not completely urban, but it probably does remind me more of a big built-up urban city and a compact urban city like New York, closer than anything else. So that's kind of the main difference here than anywhere else. It's convenient to get around, as I mentioned. Public transport, the subway system is just terrific. The taxis here are cheap. Unfortunately, the housing is incredibly expensive here, but it's also an international city. And that's one of the great things about Hong Kong. It's really such an international city. It's obviously primarily Chinese, 90%, but probably 90% or more. But you also have a huge expatriate community. You have a huge the minority population of Hong Kong includes a lot of people from South Asia, a lot of people from elsewhere in Asia. But as well, you have a lot of Americans, British, Australians, Canadians. There's a huge French community here. So it is a real international city. And if you like to dine out, as I do, my wife and I like to go out to dinner. It's also a great restaurant city, including not only great Chinese food, but food from around the world. They have a lot of Michelin star chefs here. So it's just an absolute terrific place to be living.
Correct me if I'm wrong, roughly 7 million people live there and some close to 30,000 students at the University of Hong Kong?
Yeah, about 8 million people now, I think, including all of the expatriates and domestic workers and others.
Densest city in the world?
Probably one of. Tokyo perhaps maybe more dense in parts, but Tokyo also is kind of more spread out and sprawling than Hong Kong. Hong Kong is actually quite small. It's a relatively compact place, which makes it more dense.
There is a certain segment of media world in the United States that is suggesting almost on a daily basis that there's a coming war with China. When you hear that, based on your perspective, what do you think?
Well, I think there's a coming conflict. I don't think it's going to be a war. I don't think if there is any war, and I hope there isn't, I really do hope there is not, but I don't think it would be an old-fashioned kind of shooting war. I think that's kind of old-fashioned. I think the next war is going to be cyber. There's definitely a growing competition. I do think there are smart people on both sides who recognize that an outright conflict would be too devastating for either side and something useless in this day and age. I do think these two great powers, the United States as the current sole superpower and China as the rising superpower that's looking to expand their influence in the region, especially here in Asia, they've got to learn how to accommodate each other a bit. I don't see, as I mentioned, a shooting war, but again, there is always that possibility of what I call the tragic mistake. You've got in the South China Sea, for example, you've got a lot of planes and ships in a very limited space, a very crowded space for sea lanes and for airspace. There's always the possibility of an accident. There's always a possibility of ships bumping into each other or planes bumping into each other that could then lead to some kind of an escalation. I was reading with fascination how one of my old editor, Bob Woodward at the Washington Post with Robert Costa, they have a new book out called Peril, in which they report that General Mark Milley, the Joint Chiefs Chairman, had to actually call the Chinese and assure them that nothing was going to happen, that President Trump, at the end of his term in office, was not going to start a war with China. Those are the kinds of communications I think that should be going on, because, as I mentioned, the biggest chance for a conflict, for an open-armed conflict between the U.S. and China, would be for there to be some kind of a mistake or a miscommunication going on. That's a real possibility, but I do think that there are enough guardrails in place to keep that from happening. Now, that doesn't mean there won't be conflict of another sort, but I don't think it's going to be an open-armed conflict.
I want to go down the list of the places that you've worked in your life and get you just to give us a brief snapshot of the big takeaway you have from these different assignments. Let's start with in 1986, the Southeast Asia assignment. What's the big takeaway from those 4 years?
The big takeaway from those 4 years in Southeast Asia is at the time I thought that the region was heading towards a more kind of democratic future, that a lot of the countries in the region were looking to become a lot more democratic, that the authoritarianism perhaps was on the back foot in that part of the world in Southeast Asia, that the press was becoming a little bit freer, that people were having a few more rights. Yeah, looking back now from 1986 until now, that's a long time. And I'm looking around that part of the world, and I see Thailand is under a military regime yet again, having gone through some bouts of democracy, but they've gone back under kind of a hardline military regime. Myanmar is yet again under a military regime after having gone through a bout of democracy. Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos are still, basically under single-party communist authoritarian states. Cambodia is a big disappointment. We thought after the Vietnamese troop withdrawal and elections there might be a chance that it would become more democratic. But Hun Sen, the prime minister who I covered in the late 1980s, is still prime minister in Cambodia today. The Philippines, which was the democratic success story under Cory Aquino in 1986 when I went there, is now under an authoritarian under President Duterte, who looks like he's trying to extend his term in office despite having a single-term limit by running for vice president now and installing a loyalist. We don't know who, but perhaps even his own daughter as the presidential candidate, which would allow him to keep power behind the scenes. And they've taken a very dark authoritarian turn. Singapore is still basically under a single party. They have elections, and the single party does win those elections, but it's still basically controlled by the People's Action Party. Malaysia has become a bit of a mess. I mean, nobody kind of quite knows what's happening there, but they kind of had several prime ministers over the last couple of years after we thought it was taking a democratic path. Indonesia is the one I think that still is kind of the outlier. They still seem to be on the democratic path. It seems to be more open than some of the other places I've mentioned. Although even there, you still see some kind of problems popping up there with a shift towards kind of a more radical version of Islam that seems to be kind of influencing the government in Indonesia. But I have to say, given everything else going on in the region, it still probably is the most stable democracy in the region, which is a surprise because when I was there in '86, Indonesia was still under President Suharto, which is an authoritarian regime.
Africa, you spent 1991 to 1994. What did you take away from that experience, and what do you see now?
Well, the other thing, kind of similar. I mean, when I was in Africa, I was actually thinking that we might be seeing the wave of democracy that swept through Eastern Europe and eventually through the Soviet Union, which then became Russia. And I thought we might be seeing that democratic wave sweeping through Africa. When I arrived there, it was just after Kenneth Kaunda was ousted in a democratic election in Zambia. And there were calls for democratic elections elsewhere. Some of the autocrats were being toppled in Ethiopia, in where Mengistu was toppled, in Somalia, where the Siad Barre regime was gone. But when I look over now, I see some of the same folks are still in power, and they've been there ever since. Still since I was there before. I mean, Museveni is still in power in Uganda. Paul Kagame is still in power in Rwanda. It's sad to see. There have been more elections, but there seems to be this kind of turn back towards strongman rule. We've just had, military governments and coups coming back in some of the West African countries. So it's been disappointing. Zimbabwe, Mugabe was finally kind of toppled. But it's kind of far from clear how democratic Zimbabwe has become. And, one of the interesting countries I still keep following is South Africa. And obviously corruption has become a huge problem. The income inequality, the gap between the whites and non-whites is still as great as ever before. There's been a lot of disappointment with the African National Congress there, the ANC, but we'll have to see if Cyril Ramaphosa, a guy who I thought should have been president, several terms ago, but never quite made it there. But he's finally president now. We'll have to see if he can do anything to kind of really close the income gap, reduce the corruption. The Jacob Zuma regime in South Africa was terrible. We'll have to see if South Africa can improve at all under the Cyril Ramaphosa's reign there now. But again, it's been a huge disappointment. But on the other hand, I mean, the democracy has stayed stable. The ANC is still in power. They haven't really had any real competition for power. So we'll have to see how that goes. The biggest problem there is just corruption. But I wrote a book about Africa at the time. I'd probably write the same book again now.
If I read it right, you were in Hong Kong between 1995 and 2000, and it was in 1997 when the British turned over the Hong Kong to the Chinese and gave them 50 years to get ready to be part of the mainland. What's the difference for you now, looking back to that first assignment?
It's interesting because, we thought at the time in 1997 when the Chinese took over that there would be a huge change in Hong Kong. The worst case scenario is that they would send troops over the border and impose kind of new national security restrictions, and newspapers might be shut down if they were too independent here in Hong Kong. That the political parties and civil society would be kind of shut down. That people would be forced to leave or face prison time for being too outspoken. In 1997, none of that happened. I mean, China came in and took a kind of very hands-off approach to Hong Kong. And, we woke up on, July 1st and later on in 1997 after the handover, and we all were surprised that nothing really had changed. People, we all came here. The Washington Post opened the bureau here in 1995 because we all thought that this was going to be the biggest story of 1997. This kind of a Chinese takeover of this freewheeling, quasi-democratic capitalist city. It wasn't the biggest story in 1997 because the Chinese takeover of Hong Kong became almost a non-event. In fact, the biggest story of 1997 was the Asian economic crisis, which came a month or so later when the Thai baht collapsed, and followed by the Indonesian rupiah, and followed by the Malaysian ringgit and the South Korean won. All these economies in Asia collapsed. So the Southeast Asian and Asian economic crisis became the biggest story of 97, not the Hong Kong handover, because nothing really happened in Hong Kong. The Chinese Communist Party took over, and we didn't see a whole lot of change at the time in Hong Kong. What we're seeing now going on in Hong Kong, which basically started with the imposition of a national security law in 2020, we've seen newspapers closed. We've seen political parties disbanding themselves. We've seen opposition politicians in jail or they're having to flee into exile. We see this new national security law forcing books to be taken off shelves, movies being censored, academics being told that they can't teach certain topics becoming off limits, people censoring themselves. Everything that we thought would happen in 1997 is happening now. So I kind of say, look, 1997 was the official handover of Hong Kong to China, but the year 2020 was kind of the makeover. That's when China started making Hong Kong over into a place that more resembles mainland China than resembles the Hong Kong we all got to know. So I guess we had to wait a few years. We had to wait over a couple of decades or more, 22, 23 years. But finally, what we thought would happen is happening now. And so Hong Kong is a completely different place now, just because of the sweeping, very draconian national security law that was imposed at the end of June or July 1st of 2020.
You were in Paris 2000 to 2005. What's your view of that experience, and what do you see there now?
Paris and covering Europe was a terrific time. I was there during the expansion of the European Union. It expanded to include the eastern countries. It's expanded to include Poland. It included Czech Republic. It included Slovakia. So it was a really fascinating time to be there. And France itself was interesting to cover. Some of the things that have happened since, I believe, had their predicate in the time that I covered it there. And among other things, I always talked about what I saw in Europe as the democratic deficit. They expanded to the eastern countries, which was always part of the big European project. But they never actually had kind of buy-in from the population on these sorts of things. Whenever treaties went up in Europe for a popular vote, they almost always were defeated. The Treaty of Nice, which was supposed to kind of be the new treaty that was going to outline the contours of this expansion, it was actually defeated when it came up for votes in places like France and in places like the Netherlands, where the population said, we're not ready for this. It's too much. But then, the bureaucrats would always kind of figure out a way to shove it through anyways. You keep tinkering with it and put it up for another vote, another vote, another vote, a vote until it passed. But again, this expansion of European powers over national powers, this expansion of the Brussels bureaucracy taking place over the nation states of Europe was always something that was kind of, to put it crudely, kind of shoved down the throats of Europeans and never really quite kind of accepted in a democratic process by Europeans. And to me, that led to Brexit. It was basically a lot of sovereignty being taken away from national governments and being incorporated into the European government, control over borders, control over immigration, control over the justice system, et cetera. Finally, it was the British who, not surprisingly said, enough is enough. We want out. This is not what we kind of signed up for. And of course, when they had a vote, the vote went very narrowly, but substantially to leave the European Union. To me, having been there during that whole period, I was not surprised by that Brexit vote. And in fact, if they ever allowed that kind of a vote in other countries, I think you might actually see other countries voting to leave. The other thing that I find kind of really interesting there is how the mainstream centrist parties have all kind of collapsed. So when I was there, it was always the Gaullist party on the right in France, and then the Socialist party on the left. At the time, the party of Francois Mitterrand and Francois Hollande, and then the party of Jacques Chirac and Nicolas Sarkozy. So it's fascinating to me that how in France specifically and across Europe, you've seen these parties of the center left and the center right have lost a huge amount of their support, with that support now being very fragmented around. We saw that just recently in the German election, where the two big parties of the past, the Socialist Party and the Christian Democratic Union, they together probably only got about half the vote. So these parties that used to dominate, are now being forced into coalitions, or in France's case, you've now got a complete political unknown a couple of decades ago. Macron, who had no party, who came in from pretty much nowhere and took over the French presidency. The other thing that's kind of fascinating there is the rise of the extremes. I mean, I covered Jean-Marie Le Pen. I've interviewed him in France, and now you see his daughter, Marine Le Pen, has got a reasonable shot at the presidency by building on this kind of discontent that's going on. So in the United States, we had, the rise of Trump and the Trump faction of the Republican Party. So it waits to be, it's still to be seen whether or not this kind of populist wave will lead to another populist being elected. You did have Viktor Orban in Hungary when I was there, and I covered him and his Fidesz party when they were just first coming onto the scene in Hungary. But, it remains to be seen whether one of the Western European countries will have some kind of similar kind of populist movement that actually was able to take power. And I'm looking very closely at the French election to see what happens next year.
When was your time in Iraq and Afghanistan?
That was during the Paris stint. So I arrived in Paris in 2000, ended up going to Afghanistan in 2001. Hard to believe we were there 20 years later. And in 2003, when the invasion of Iraq happened, I went there from Paris as well. So Paris was kind of the place from which you went to cover some of these conflicts going on, both in Iraq and Afghanistan. I also went to Israel, the Palestinian territories, and other places in Africa. I went to Morocco and Algeria and elsewhere.
Do you remember what you thought about the future of the Iraq situation and the Afghanistan situation when you were there?
Yeah, I do remember. I went back and forth to Afghanistan more during that period of time, and then later I went to Afghanistan. I went between 2001 and 2010. I think was my last trip to Afghanistan, and I remember just thinking that we, the United States and the Western Coalition, NATO, we had no real reason to be there that long. We were trying to do nation building, but we weren't actually admitting that we were there doing nation building. We were trying to do nation building on the sly, or nation building on the cheap, whatever you want to call it. I remember them talking about building the Afghan army, and I went there. I went around there for a while with my home state Senator Carl Levin. Rest in peace. He passed away recently, but I remember I've known him since I was a college student. Covered his first campaign for Senate. Rode around in a car with him. I remember him complaining about how we weren't doing enough to build up the Afghan army. This was 2010, and I remember thinking to myself, "My God, it's been 9 years. We've been 9 years in Afghanistan, and we still haven't built up an Afghan army." Little did I know that in 2021. We would still be complaining that we hadn't built up the Afghan army. How much money did we sink into Afghanistan? And I remember going back at my last trip there in 2010 and previous trips when I went into Afghanistan. I remember thinking how it was kind of what was being reported back about the progress we were making just didn't match what I was seeing on the ground. I mean, these Afghan cities, it didn't surprise me at all when they all collapsed one after the other. Because the Afghan government was never particularly in control of them. Government officials could say they controlled the cities during the daytime, but the Taliban more easily ruled at night. Place I went to Kunduz, I went to Kandahar, I went to Jalalabad, I went to Helmand Province, I went to Herat. In all of these places, it was always the Afghan government and the security forces could claim to control the centers of the cities during the daytime, but at nighttime, people claimed the Taliban would come in. They intimidated local officials. They conducted assassinations. So the Taliban ruled at night, and it was just always kind of a fallacy that this Afghan government was actually in charge of much of anything beyond the green zone in Kabul, despite the fact that we were pumping in just billions of dollars into Afghanistan. And again, I mean, I know it's quite controversial. A lot of people say we should have left the residual force there, et cetera. But, I have to agree with Joe Biden. If after 20 years we're still saying that this government can't stand on its own 2 feet, if after 20 years we're still saying this Afghan army can't do its own logistics and supplies and needs the Americans there for, as a background force, then we hadn't done our job. I mean, 20 years is long enough. 10 years is long enough. I was thinking that in 2010 during my last trip to Afghanistan. It was way enough time.
You graduated from the University of Michigan in 1980, grew up in Detroit.
Yes.
You mentioned Carl Levin. What do you take away from your relationship with him as you were starting out in this business?
Oh, he was a great guy. I kind of kept in touch with him a little bit over the years. He was always very generous every time I saw him. I remember the first time I was a young reporter at the Michigan Daily School newspaper, and I really was interested in kind of politics and government, and went to cover his campaign for Senate in 1978. He was running against a guy named Bob Griffin, and he let me ride around in his car with him doing some campaigning, and he was such a energetic guy, and I'm the young college student. I think I fell asleep in the back of the car as he was driving me. He was driving me back to Detroit from some upstate visits. He was always a stand-up guy. I thought it was really interesting that he got involved in armed services. He was the president of the Detroit City Council when I was growing up. I always remembered him as a liberal Democrat on the Detroit City Council, but then he got involved in the armed services and foreign policy. Which I thought was really interesting, and it also probably, and to some degree, instilled in me this interest in foreign policy and military and defense issues as well, because he showed that you can be an urban Democrat from Detroit but still care about foreign policy and still care about defense issues, and I always thought that was really, really great about Carl Levin. And also he had his brother Sander Levin was also in Congress at the time, and I see his son now is in Congress. So it's great to see a prominent family there. Great to see a Michigander there. I got to say, one of my colleagues from the Michigan Daily, who's now with the Washington Post, Lenny Bernstein, had a terrific story in the paper in the Washington Post recently about there was a sexual harassment scandal going on at University of Michigan when we were there. In the 1970s, 76 to 1980, and we knew nothing about it at the time. and it touches on the athletics department, and it touched on a physician who's no longer alive, and abuse that was suffered by some young student athletes at the time. And God, I just kicked myself that as student journalists, we just didn't know anything about that at the time. We read the stories about what happened at Michigan State, with the physician who was abusing a young gymnast and others there. But we had a similar scandal going on at the University of Michigan, and that's really one of the things I just wish we had known something at the time, and we could have done something as student journalists at the Michigan Daily.
When you were 9 years old, the Detroit civil rights explosion happened with 43 dead, several hundred injured. Do you remember that, and did it have any impact on you or your family?
Absolutely remember it. I remember the National Guard troops coming in. I remember having the huddle. We slept in the living room because we were worried about stray bullets coming into the window of the upstairs part of our house. And I remember the National Guard troops. I remember the neighborhood shops that I used to go buy my comic books. The neighborhood Cunningham's drugstore and the Kresge's and all these places. I remember them burning to the ground. I remember my father taking me out there to just have a look as the firemen were trying to fight the blazes. And he said, "Take a look. I want you to see what your people are doing to their own city." It definitely had an indelible impact, on me growing up to see that kind of violence in an American city. Now, I've seen it subsequently. I watched on television the Los Angeles riots after Rodney King. And I watched the protest that went on after the murder of George Floyd under a policeman's knee. And it's interesting that some of the same issues are still there. Some of the same, after the Detroit riots, you came out with the Kerner report that talked about how America was still two societies, one black and one white. And how you needed, among other things, they put the blame on the news media, saying that newsrooms needed to be more integrated because they weren't telling the stories of the black community. This was after the 1967 Detroit riots. The same thing could have been said, after the George Floyd murder in 2020, in the George Floyd protest that went on. It's to me, it's absolutely fascinating how little changed during that period. Now, we started to see this kind of racial reckoning that went on. We started to see kind of these statues of, Confederate generals coming down, including in Richmond, Virginia, which is kind of amazing. Some of that should have happened decades ago. But on the other hand, I look now and I see kind of the, this movement for police and justice reform in Congress has stalled out yet again. I thought something might, happen with that. This time around, I thought there was enough support on both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democratic, for that. But nothing seems to have gotten done. I see this kind of rollback of the Democratic push for election reform in the U.S. It's been kind of stalled in the Senate. So, the hope that I had that maybe finally, after all these years following 67, we're going to see some kind of legislative changes. None of that's. A lot of that stalled out. There have been some changes. I mentioned the statues coming down, the renaming of the Wilson School, et cetera. But those are the more symbolic things. Some of the more systematic things haven't been done yet. So it's been a bit disappointing to see kind of the movement from the George Floyd protest have kind of seemed to me to be kind of fizzling out a little bit now. So we'll have to wait and see what comes.
2007 to 2010, you were in New York City. What do you remember about that experience?
Well, the funny thing is, the first thing I covered in New York City when I got there as a correspondent, I was foreign editor for a while, and went up to New York City. The absolute first story I had to cover was the resignation of Elliot Spitzer because of a sex scandal. And now I look back and I say, my God, now that was before the Me Too movement. And now we go back and we have another New York governor in Andrew Cuomo having to resign because of a scandal over sexual harassment, et cetera. And I keep thinking to myself, my God, has nothing changed in Albany, in all of this time? There was, so that was one really interesting thing. I was also there. It's really interesting. I was there, a couple of things. I was there and I covered the election in New Jersey of Chris Christie. This is a guy who I thought, had what it takes to possibly one day become president. He did run, and I think his campaign kind of fizzled out, maybe because of Bridgegate, which hung over his campaign. But the other thing I got to cover, which I'm very lucky to say, was I got to cover that epic political battle for the Democratic primary between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. I got to travel on Obama's plane a little bit. We went on a western swing through Montana and South Dakota. And I got to cover kind of the battle in the Northeast because from New York City, I was able to cover kind of New Jersey, New York, Rhode Island, all the way up to Massachusetts. And that was absolutely, I mean, as politics go, that was just an epic battle for the Democratic nomination, which Obama eventually won, eked out over Hillary Clinton. And then, it was a terrific battle for John McCain. So if you're into politics, that was one for the ages, and it was one I'm glad I was able to cover. So probably one of the biggest memories I have of that whole period. The other thing I actually remember was that was also a period of time during that period I was in New York when we got the first rulings, usually coming from courts and sometimes from state legislatures involving same-sex marriage. And I'm really glad to say I was kind of in on the ground floor of watching that change.
Where did you meet your wife?
In Paris. Absolutely. The first person I met in Paris was my wife. She was actually working for a French bank, BNP Paribas. So we've been friends for 20 years, but just got married relatively recently when we came here to Hong Kong.
What does she think about all this travel around and you being away?
Well, we've had a great time traveling together, as a matter of fact, and it's great to find somebody who doesn't mind being on the road and enjoys being on the road. Although I have to say, because of the pandemic and because of the very strict quarantine rules they have here in Hong Kong, I mean, anybody coming from many countries, including the U.S., they have to do 21 days in forced hotel quarantine upon return. So, as a consequence of that, and also the difficulty of flights, we have not set foot out of Hong Kong since late 2019. So I got to say, this is kind of the longest I've been in one place, I think, since I graduated from college. I'm not used to this. I was looking through my drawer the other day to find something, and under a pile of papers and other things, I came across my passport, and it was looking at me forlornly, asking, how come we haven't gone anywhere in the last 2 years or so? I can't wait to actually. I'm double vaccinated. My wife is double vaccinated, but really because of this kind of very draconian, very strict quarantine regime for Hong Kong, which has kept the virus, to a minimum here, I must say. So it's been quite successful. But it also means it just makes it really almost impossible to travel because I really don't want to come back and have to do 21 days forced hotel quarantine, which you have to actually pay for as well. So it's not cheap, on top of other things.
Tell us some other...
I'm looking forward to traveling again. Sorry?
Tell us some other restrictions on you in Hong Kong because of COVID.
Well, that's been the main thing. I mean, Hong Kong never had a very strict lockdown. We did work from home for quite a while. And last year, so the year basically 2020, September 2020 until June of 2021, most of our classes had to be conducted online. We weren't doing many face-to-face classes, and that was a real disappointment. It's a disappointment for the instructors like myself because we don't actually get to meet our students and talk to them and give them that kind of in-person coaching and experience that they come to us for. When you're teaching journalism, I teach feature writing. I need to sit down with the students, and talk to them one-on-one. But more importantly, it's hard for the students. It's hard for them to stay concentrated online and not getting the full, rich experience that we want to give them. So that was the main thing, was teaching through online. Now, we've all become experts on Zoom. I'm getting really sick of Zoom by now. I like to do things face-to-face. But that's been the main restriction. We went through we had about 3 or 4 waves of the virus coming through here. And again, it was nowhere near anything like in the U.S. I mean, right now to this point, they've only had about 215 or so deaths during the entire epidemic from COVID, and only a few thousand cases. So very, very minor because of this kind of strict zero COVID strategy. But they've had a couple of waves, and they went through a period of time when things closed here at restaurants and bars. And bars were closed for a very long time. Restaurants had to close at 6 p.m. Movie theaters, entertainment places were closed. Swimming pools and gyms were closed for a long time. Those are all open back again now. Movie theaters are open. Gyms are back open again. They still have restrictions on outdoor gatherings. I tend to think a lot of that's political because the COVID coincided with the protests that were going on here in 2019, and COVID came in early 2020. So with these restrictions, only 4 people are allowed to gather outside at any one time. Again, this is selectively enforced, and I think that's a way of crowd control. It's a way the police can keep down on protests as opposed to COVID, because now people can dine indoors, et cetera. So it doesn't really make any sense scientifically, except it is a way that allows the police to make sure that there are no more protests going on here. But other than that, I mean, we've actually been very, very fortunate to be able to lead relatively normal lives, with the exception that Hong Kong, as I mentioned, is a pretty small place, a pretty compact place. And without that ability to travel in and out, you're not taking those weekend trips to Japan or Thailand or China, or being able to take a couple of weeks and go back to the States and see friends and family. So that's been the biggest restriction, is the not being able to travel.
There isn't an hour, probably there isn't 15 minutes that goes by here in the United States where almost all media will write about either masks or vaccination. What's it like in Hong Kong for those two issues?
Well, the thing that's interesting here is everybody masked up right away. I mean, don't forget the virus was first discovered in Wuhan, China, which is just over the border from us here, and we're an island, but we're part of the mainland in the sense of China's sovereignty. But the local Hong Kongers put their masks on in late January of 2020, and kind of never took them off, and they did it not complaining. You walk outside now and you see pretty much everybody wearing a mask, and nobody complains about it. That has contributed, I think, enormously to keeping the COVID rate here incredibly low. For a dense, packed city like this, where everybody's riding the MTR and everybody's packing in the restaurants, et cetera, the rates have been incredibly low. Most of the cases now for the last, I think, about 5 months or so, almost all the cases here have been what they call imported cases, people coming in from overseas, and they catch them, most of these, in these kind of quarantine hotels. But they haven't had any virus circulating in the community here, at least for about 5 months now, because everybody religiously wears their masks. I mean, and that's why I find the debate about masks in the U.S. kind of, I don't understand it, because masks are such an easy tool. It's not easy. We all find them uncomfortable. I mean, it's hot in Hong Kong sometimes in the summer months, and I sweat. But you wear the mask. You just wear the mask. It's just what you do. It's funny. You see people. If I'm a public transport guy, but I stand outside, I see people sitting in their car, driving to and from wherever they're going, wearing a mask in their own car. People here just religiously wear their masks. Now, they had the experience of SARS, the respiratory disease that swept through here in the early 2000s. So they know, what an infectious disease can do, and they just wear the masks without complaint. The flip side of that is the vaccine rate is not as high as it should be. It's actually relatively low. I think they're about 59, maybe hitting 60% now after months and months and months. Plenty of vaccine available, so much available they might have to dump some of it if it's not used up. Because the rate of infections here, the rate of actual COVID cases here was so low that a lot of people don't feel the need to take the vaccine. They say, well, why should I take the vaccine? We don't have any COVID here. Or why should I take the vaccine? Because I could just wear a mask. It's not a problem. So in some ways, Hong Kong has been a victim of their own success. Because the rates have been so low, people don't feel the urgency to get the vaccines, even though there are plenty available. They've had a Sinovac, which is the Chinese-produced vaccine, and they've had the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine, which is the one that I and my wife have taken. So it was, we got it back in April, no problem at all. Just, make an appointment online, walk in, get vaccinated. My question is whether we're going to get the booster shot, which I know is being started now. I think President Biden took one. But again, here in Hong Kong, because we don't have that many cases, people don't think there's a need to really start with booster shots yet, because there's just no COVID around at the moment, other than some of these imported cases, and most of those get caught at the airport. The other thing that Hong Kong did very, very well, and I think the U.S. really fell down on this in the beginning, was kind of the contact tracing. If anyone here came down with COVID, they did a pretty darn good job, especially in those early days, of tracking every place that person had been, everyone that they'd been in contact with. If they lived in an apartment building, here as most people do, they would make everybody in the apartment building go do some mandatory testing and sometimes go into forced quarantine. In the States, I was just amazed that people were flying in, not having to isolate, not having to quarantine, and there was no way to know where people were. So there was no contact tracing at all really going on. So that was a real surprise to me at how, and again, if they had just looked at what was happening in China, looked at what was happening in Hong Kong, looked at what was happening in Asia and in Italy and elsewhere, the U.S. had plenty of time in February, March, April of 2020 to plan for what was coming. And nothing was done. It wasn't done.
Two things about Hong Kong I want to ask you about. If it's reported that there are more skyscrapers in Hong Kong than anywhere in any city in the world, and that the busiest air cargo airport is right there in Hong Kong. Are both of those correct from your viewpoint? And what impact does that have on a densely populated spot in the world?
Yeah, I think that's true. I've heard that about the number of skyscrapers. I think that's true. Pretty much every building here is a skyscraper. If there were some low-rise buildings, pretty much all of those get knocked down and replaced by a skyscraper at some point. So, yeah, it makes for a very dramatic and, I think, beautiful cityscape to have these number of skyscrapers. And if you come here, one of the things that's most stunning, I think, is how they can build these skyscrapers into the sides of hills and mountains. It is quite beautiful, but it is high-rise living. But at the same time, they've managed to keep a lot of green space here. There's a lot of undeveloped areas. There are a lot of country parks. There are a lot of hiking trails. And in addition to this main rock that we're on called Hong Kong Island, there are a lot of smaller islands where it's very rural, and you know it's you can go out and see nature as well, and you can just take ferry boats between the islands, and it's quite dramatic. So that's a real terrific part of it. You know, and again, Hong Kong's an island, pretty much. I mean, there's a part of it, the Kowloon Peninsula, that's connected to mainland China, but for all practical purposes, Hong Kong's an island, so pretty much everything here has to be flown in. It comes by ship or it's flown in. And so that actually was a problem during COVID when shipping was disrupted and air freight was disrupted. I remember trying to send in fact, I was trying to send some masks. We had plenty of masks to go around here, and I was trying to send masks back to friends in Detroit when COVID was hitting Detroit very hard. And it was hard because if you went to the regular post office, they'd say, well, sorry, there are no planes going to the United States. I couldn't get the mask there. I had to go to FedEx, and, prices were incredibly high. And, so things are getting a little bit more back to normal now. Shipping is still taking a long time. I'm told by my friends who are in the shipping business now that if you want to order anything but for Christmas, you better get the order in now. We're worried if we can ever get Christmas trees here, on time, because shipping is backed up because of big problems in ports in the U.S. and big problems in ports in Europe. Shipping rates are also through the roof now. So it is one of the problems living on an island that pretty much everything has to come here from somewhere else. A lot of stuff comes from mainland China, but that border has been partially closed because of COVID, not because of SARS. That border has been partially closed. They've closed they only have about 3 of the border crossings that are open now. The airport's open, and 2 land border crossings are open from Shenzhen. So it's severely restricted kind of goods coming across the border.
Going to wrap it up here in a second, but I want to ask you about
Sure.
What does the United States look like right now from where you are?
Well, that's a great question. I and you're asking me before they solve this kind of debt and financial issue that's going on here. I mean, it looks incredibly polarized at the moment, and I know I had a lot of hope when Biden came in that the polarization would give way, but when I see this kind of the people still thinking that the election was stolen. I see the former president, the former guy, as he's called, going around giving rallies and still talking about a fraudulent election and stop the steal and all that. And people believing it, it makes me a little bit nervous for what's going on. I mean, now. And then when I see the Democrats kind of forming a circular firing squad and not doing simple things like go ahead and pass this infrastructure bill. I despair. What's happening to the country here? I mean, I can understand the politics of trying to hold out and use your muscle to get through the bills that you want. But I mean, the simple thing that you're not passing a bipartisan infrastructure deal when one of the key things about Asia, and specifically Hong Kong here, that I think I mentioned before, is how efficient everything is here for the public transport, the roads, the bridges, et cetera. And I fly back to New York or Newark, and the roads are a mess. The bridges are falling apart. The infrastructure is falling apart. It's all old and it hasn't been repaired or fixed. And the fact that we can't just pass this thing and get it done and start people back to work, it really does make me despair. And then I see these culture wars going on in the States, and I just think, what is going on here? I see what Texas is doing with abortion. I keep thinking, this is ideological madness kind of run amok in the U.S. The big debate out in this part of the world that you see a lot is whether the U.S. is a declining power and whether China is a rising power. But underlying that, I guess, is another question as to whether democracy really works. And a lot of people look at China and they say, look at the way China has handled COVID, for example. It's China is an authoritarian communist government, but they know how to, lock down an apartment building or lock down a city when there's COVID cases and make sure it doesn't spread. Even though Wuhan is the place where COVID was first discovered, they managed to contain it using pretty strict authoritarian methods. And then people look at the U.S. and say, you guys call yourself the world's greatest open democracy, but look at what a mess you've had. You've had 600,000 people die of COVID because you can't even make people wear masks. You can't even make people get vaccinated. You give people too much freedom. And so I think it's not an exaggeration to say when you're in this part of the world and looking back at the U.S., democracy is on the line. People are saying it doesn't work. People are saying, you can't make your debt payments. You can't even pass an infrastructure bill. You can't even get people to wear a mask and take a vaccine when it's scientifically proven. How can you go around the world preaching that everybody else should be a democracy when your democracy is not working? You can't do the simple things. And I think what China is doing is showcasing an authoritarian model that, despite all of its human rights abuses and the things that we care about, it works. It's efficient. They get, everybody was wearing a mask. Everybody's getting vaccinated. So again, I think it's a huge problem. It's really, really become a lot more difficult to defend America and defend American democracy when you see such a mess going on in the U.S. 670,000 people didn't have to die of COVID. So that's what I see. I see it's very, very hard to be a defender of democracy and a defender of the American system when I see what's going on right now.
Keith Richburg, thank you very much for your time from Hong Kong. We appreciate it very much.
Thanks for listening. Please rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.